Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization Show, the home of Googleization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy shift going on all around us and explore the disruptive convergence of technology, business, and people. Here are your hosts, Ira Wolfe and Jason Cochran.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization, winner of the Most Forward-Thinking Impact Award from People Forward Network. I'm Ira Wolfe, and thank you for being part of Googleization Nation.
And I'm Jason Cochran. If you think this is just another podcast, think again. We are the voice of the most important, crucial conversations that are confronting business leaders and people today. Our goal with the show is to bring you ways to reimagine tomorrow and explore the impact and convergence of business, technology, and people.
This episode of Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization is sponsored by our partner, Y Institute, your personal and professional GPS for a meaningful life and purpose-filled career. You'll hear more about the Y Institute and their Y operating system a little later in the show. Before we get started, just a few reminders. We are SHRM certified, so if you're interested in earning credits for listening to any of our episodes, anywhere between a half a credit to a full credit, you can go to our website, geeksgeezersandgoogleization.com or geeksgeezersgoogleization.com, either one. And on there you can click on podcasts, and there is a short form you need to fill out, answer a few questions to prove that you listen to the show. And then we will send you an activity code. So you can easily do that by going to geeksgeezersgoogleization.com. While you're there, if you're not a member of googleizationnation.com, please do so. You'll get updates about last week's show, upcoming shows, and today's show, and you definitely don't want to miss that. And if you're listening on a podcast, please rate and review the episode and or the show. Every little bit helps, and we're looking to spread our message. So for many of our listeners, and especially you, Jason, you know that one of my abilities is connecting dots, often seeing patterns that other people don't see right away. Or maybe some people might call it coloring outside the lines. So I'm not sure which one it is, but I digress a bit but recently, two of our guests, both New York Times bestselling authors and experts in the future of aging, Stephen Kotler and Chip Conley, talked about this, and they called it wisdom, that connecting of the dots as that comes with age and experience. Well, hopefully our conversation today will help others become not just smarter, but wiser. So this morning on the way to a meeting, a pretty early meeting, I was listening to a podcast about the future of death. Now that seems like a pretty maybe boring or morbid topic, but it was fascinating and I highly recommend it. It's a part of a new series on Audible from South by Southwest or SXSW called Futurology. And one of the questions they asked us to explore was how our relationship with death changed over the last century, and especially with technology. And it got me thinking, because this is the question they asked: how is technology changing that relationship, our personal relationship with death? And it got me thinking about today, because we're going to be talking about getting workplace mental health right with Melissa Doman, is how is our relationship with mental health changing? So I'm really stoked to talk to Melissa today. She's an organizational psychologist. That's easy for me to say. And her visiting the show couldn't come at a better time because my brain synapses as I was driving today were just firing about how do we reframe this whole conversation about mental health. And that follows on the heels of a conversation I had yesterday, because I had the good fortune to meet with a team of warehouse supervisors. These are up and coming leaders in an organization that is a family-owned business that is just growing leaps and bounds. And they each took a leadership assessment, and really it was an opportunity to just meet them and review the assessment and help them on their guide. But what I learned from them was priceless. My colleague and I, who were there, got to hear some really personal stories, including one manager that shared how stressed out he was, how burned out he was as recently as 18 to 24 months ago. And these were his words: "I can't seem to turn it off." And we used to call that good work ethic. Companies rewarded us for workaholism, for being on all the time, for coming in late, staying late, being on call, and especially over the last few years of always being connected. And it got me thinking, if workaholism is an addiction, which we are, we're addicted to work, then why do companies reward it? Why not then reward drug use that enhances short-term performance gains, even knowing the long-term and personal consequences are devastating? Um, we seem to treat workaholism and mental health much different than some of these other things. So that may be beyond. Just want you to think about that. Um, and but it put in line what another manager told me, was that I was so committed and worried about my job, everything that I had to do with my job, that my wife told me she was thinking of leaving me because my mind always seemed to be somewhere else. So that got me thinking about something else. We talked about COVID. We all experienced COVID, the pandemic, how contagious it was in the workplace. So we isolated people, we quarantined, we went home. But mental health seems to be an epidemic or a pandemic, and it's pretty contagious because when one person is stressed or burned out or is experiencing or has a mental illness or is not mentally healthy, they got a lot of things on their mind, whether it's, as I say this lightly, simple as stress or to the extent of burnout. Um, we don't recognize that, and we think that's a weakness. And I can't help but think that we've got to reprioritize how we approach mental health in the age of such rapid change, or as our listeners have grown to know it, Googleization.
That's right. And I hear those stories, and it's clear there's no future of work if we don't get workplace mental health right, which is what we're going to talk with Melissa about today. And that's not up for debate anymore. In fact, the World Health Organization lists the following conditions as risks to your mental health at work. Listen to this list real quick: underuse of skills or being underskilled for work, excessive workloads or work pace, understaffing, long, unsocial, or inflexible hours, lack of control over job design or workload, an organizational culture that enables negative behaviors, limited support from colleagues or authoritarian supervision, violence, harassment, or bullying, discrimination, exclusion, an unclear job role, under or over promotion, job insecurity, inadequate pay or poor investment in career development, and conflicting homework demands. Whew. I mean, that list might as well be the priority list that we have for every CEO and HR leader who owns talent strategy right now. And the good news is, with this list, we have a measure of control over many of them. And the even better news is that we've got an expert, Melissa Doma, an organizational psychologist, with us today. And she literally wrote the book on how to do mental health support at work really well. The name of the book is Yes, You Can Talk About Mental Health at Work. Here's why and how to do it really well. And you've probably heard of some of the companies that she's worked with on these things regarding mental health at work. Names like Google, Dow Jones, Microsoft, Salesforce, Siemens, Estee Lauder, and Janssen, just to name a few. And you've probably also seen her content as a subject matter expert in publications such as Vogue, BBC, CNBC, Inc. magazine, and she's also one of LinkedIn's 2022 top 10 voices on mental health. She's got one core goal, and that is to equip companies, individuals, and leaders to have constructive conversations about mental health, team dynamics, and communication in the workplace.
Well, that certainly fits in with how to create, with our whys, Jason, to create a better way to challenge the status quo. But before we bring on Melissa, it's time for our perfect labor storm segment. This is where on each episode, we focus on a disruptive, surprising, or worrisome trend that we believe you should know about. Here is our perfect labor storm. And no surprise, we're going to be talking a little bit about mental health. So according to the World Health Association, or organization, around 84%, more than 8 out of 10 American workers experienced at least one mental health challenge over the past year. This included stress and burnout to depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, PTSD. That's how we got started, Jason. I met you when we had a conversation 2 years ago
That's
sounds
right.
crazy. 2 years ago, almost actually 3 years ago,
Yeah.
almost 3 years ago, about how the pandemic was going to create some episodes of PTSD. So here we are. According to the Workplace Mental Health Institute, 82%, again, 8 out of 10 workers were diagnosed with a mental health illness, and but they don't tell their workplace managers about it. Why? Because they're afraid of the negative impact on their career. It still has a stigma, being embarrassed or losing their job. And finally, according to Gallup, nearly 1 in 5 workers rate their mental health as fair or poor. It's 20% of the workforce is troubled and recognizing that they got mental health problems. 4 out of 10 U.S. workers report their job having a negative impact on their mental health, which leads to burnout, and 57% are unable to say that again. 57% are unable to confirm the existence of easily accessible mental health support services in their workplace, even when employers are trying to do it right, but the employees don't know it exists.
Yep. And so to help us unpack all of this, we've got Melissa Doman. And so let's give a warm Googleization Nation welcome to Melissa Doman as we prepare to unpack all this.
I've never had a live studio audience clapping before. Oh
Does it make you feel like, did you ever watch TGIF back in the day? And
Yes.
you always had the background. That's what it makes you feel like, right? We're back on a TGIF episode here.
It actually almost kind of felt like I was coming onto the show Full House, the original, not the remake, where there was like the studio like clapping, and I was like, Danny Tanner.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of what we were talking about earlier, in terms of when I was talking about death, what you do with social media accounts. I remember there was a big thing whenever, unfortunately, Danny passed away with that. But Melissa, we obviously don't want to dig into that topic today. We want to dig into.
God, that's a whole episode in itself.
That's a whole other episode that we'll have to talk about another time. That's fascinating.
Sure.
But today, as we get ready to talk about how to do mental health and the workplace right, let's get to know you a little bit better to start off here. You are an organizational psychologist.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of people wondering, I hear this term organizational psychologists. Yeah. Who are they and what do they do? So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got passionate about this.
Happy to explain. So I am a former clinician myself, and the main reason that I transitioned into organizational psychology, or maybe a more accessible term would be workplace psychology, is because every single one of my clients who came in to see me, none of them talked about what was going on with them at work. None of them. And a lot of them also felt that they were being, and I don't use this word lightly, tortured in the workplace in ways that they just didn't feel comfortable to try to address. And I thought, let me try and make an impact at the source, because I'm treating these patients, one at a time or small group at a time, but I feel like I'm doing it in a broken system and a broken narrative, and I feel like I'm spinning my wheels. And so I transitioned into very traditional org psych. So, director of culture and employee development, people and leadership development, very out of the box org psych stuff. So what I mean by that is focusing on the psychology of team dynamics and communication, and trying to improve those processes for people within organizations so they can feel psychologically safe with each other, so they can do their work and have a sense of purpose, so they can achieve the mission that they're all there to achieve. And I tend to look at the workplace as just an adult playground. We all just have different toys and we're a little bit older. And I got to tell you, as someone who worked for very, very toxic workplaces in my younger days, and having seen on the other side of that, being a clinician who was treating people, I basically said to myself, well, someone's got to do something about this. It might as well be me. So I transitioned into, and I still do that work, by the way. I love working with businesses around emotional intelligence, constructive conflict, intentional communication. I geek out on that stuff. I love that stuff. But what really just burned my butt is that as I was doing that work, when I tried to do some, sessions on stress in the workplace, whatever it was, if I tried to use the term mental health, the the people in the businesses around me we don't use that term in the workplace. And I was like, but why? It's just describing the health state of an organ. I don't understand the big deal, which then drove me to subspecialize in mental health at work because I was so tired of people treating that term like it was the boogeyman. And so I have kind of those two tracks of work I do is specifically around mental health at work, but also I still love working on emotional intelligence and those other pieces because they do ultimately touch each other during our workday.
Perfect. And you touched on one of the topics we want to talk about today, which is, we had some data suggesting, still more than 8 out of 10 employees don't feel comfortable talking about mental health at work.
Yeah.
Um, and so can you explain to us a little bit of why is that still the case? Are we making any progress? What are the things you're seeing that are maybe you're getting better with that, or what do we need to do to improve it?
So there's a lot of questions there. You might have to remind me all the ones that you
No,
asked.
but sorry.
So no, you're fine. So, the highlight here is yes, we're making progress. Definitely making progress. Even when I was in the world of work in the early aughts in the corporate world, I wouldn't talk about my mental health to my manager. That was like a death wish if you tried to do that. So I'm talking about things that I even experienced as someone in the workplace. And so we are making progress. And what I would say is that there is tons of progress around accurate education of what we're actually talking about as opposed to what people think we're talking about. There's a lot of progress on the intersections between diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and mental health. So what I mean by that is looking at cultural, gender, familial, other influences that affect our perceptions, our biases, our opinions, our rules around talking about this topic. So lots and lots and lots of education is there. We're also having a lot of progress around saying it's important to talk about in the workplace. And there's also a lot of progress in terms of access to resources. Where I think we are still lacking, which is something that I've really dedicated a lot in my work and also in the book, is well, we can say this is important until we're blue in the face. We can talk about the concept until we're blue in the face. But if we're not equipping people with the skills on both sides, by the way, not just the supporter, but people who are sharing, what are people going to do with what they've learned? You have to give them a way to action that education in a realistic way in the world in which it currently exists, not one with puppies and rainbows and ice cream, although that sounds amazing and I would love to live in that place. But I think that's where we're really lacking is there's a lot of I would call it performative mental health at work efforts going on in some places, or a I might be saying this word incorrectly, commoditization. Did I say that right? Commoditization of the topic where it looks good to talk about it, or it looks good that you are, checking it off this box, as opposed to really practicing it as a workplace value and teaching people how and why to have these conversations in a constructive and realistic fashion. So it's unfortunately, with anything new and shiny, even though the concept is not new, but talking about it at work is new, you have a lot of bandwagoners who are trying to jump on that bandwagon for maybe not the most helpful reasons. And so I think another place we're lacking is quality control. And I am but one woman. So I try to do what I can with the clients that I have and also through the book, but it's a bit wild west out there in terms of this topic. And I think that it's going to take years to get some more kind of realistic structure, expectations around this topic, because we're still very early days within the first 5 years of this effort. And there's a lot more to go.
Well, and I love that you focus in your book, Melissa, on making it a point of we don't need to always connect mental health in the workplace to profits, to productivity, to employee
No.
engagement. Like it really is its own thing that you need to do it for the right reasons for your people. And so, with that in mind, can you share some of the recipe pieces, the tips and
Yeah.
tricks
Yeah.
of how you might get leadership to think that way? Because I'm sure we have a lot of HR leaders right now that
Oh
are
yeah.
like, I think that way, but how do I get the other executives on my team to not be thinking about, okay, we're going to do this so that it
Yeah.
improves our business numbers?
So I'm going to say something that might surprise you. Now, let's keep in mind that there have been many cases made about why we need to talk about this. There's been the data case, the return on investment case, the bleeding heart human case, the bring your whole self to work case. All of those things aren't wrong. They're just not enough to move the needle, because each person who's a power that be within their organization has their own motivation or reasoning as to why they want to bring up this topic. And a very important example of that, by the way, is I was talking to a very senior person in a financial business. And I was talking about bringing up this topic, as part of core professional development, blah, blah, blah. And he had said to me, oh, well, I'm assuming the goal is to get the number of mental health claims to go down. I said, no, it's the other way around. You want the claims to go up so people are actually using the resources that you're paying for. And if they're using the resources that you're paying for and actually getting help and assistance, then the odds of them feeling better at work, producing better at work, are more likely. Now, you'll notice the language I use, because we cannot guarantee anything in life except for death and taxes, and lots of people don't pay taxes. So what I tend to, I'm not wrong. So the thing with that topic is, we've made all those cases, and there are still people who are like, nah, I'm not convinced. And so the approach I tend to take is, well, all those things are true, but are you observing the dumpster fire that is our planet, and it's continuing to be that way? Don't you want to give people the skills to be able to cope with that, to be able to talk with each other about that, to feel that they can talk about that in your business so they don't vote with their feet and go work for somewhere that will? It's your choice. The world is continuing. I know every generation says this, but I don't know if you saw that post from the atomic clock thing, that we're like the closest to midnight that we've ever been. Did you see that in the last 24 hours? Not the best news, just the collection of factors that are happening in the world. And a lot of the scientists who are responsible for managing that atomic clock are like, I don't know, it's not looking great. So that's the approach I tend to take, is based on the realistic context in which we all currently exist. It is bad out there. You have to equip people to be able to deal with that and talk about that. That's regardless of having a mental illness, because you have folks who have mental illness, but what about general mental health struggles? It doesn't have to always be clinical, because if you think about the feeling wheel from Dr. Gloria Wilcox, there are dozens of emotions that we're pre-programmed with out of the box to help us respond to stimuli, people, in our environment. Well, why can't we have the skill set to be able to talk about and respond what's coming at us for being alive, or as I call it, the cost of doing business? And that's the approach I tend to take, is very realistic, because all the other cases before kind of helped, but didn't get it across. So I tend to use logical, observable facts that people can't argue with. And that seems to hit the mark.
And Melissa, this all fits into the story. One is, and this sounds terrible, but I love the fact that you talked about it, that our world's a dumpster fire, because actually that's one of my slides. I actually have a big dumpster fire, and in a presentation called No BS, the No BS culture, which is no burnout or stress. And I'm presenting that next week at International Builders Show, and Jason and I have done that together, several times, and hope to this year. But with kind of going on what you then followed up with that. And I mentioned this earlier, and this just hit me in that listening to the podcast this morning, is that stress, I never considered this, stress is a contagion in the workplace. So imagine, we go back to COVID, and I know this could be controversial, this isn't political, but imagine they said, listen, if you test positive, if you have symptoms, you can come to work, just don't tell anybody. Don't wear a mask, don't treat yourself, just come to work, and, we'll just ignore it, and hopefully it doesn't spread. The fact is, we treat mental health that way, or mental illness that way. We treat stress that way. We treat burnout that way, that people come to work stressed out. It's the dumpster fire. They have things going on at work with their bosses, toxic culture, personal things, whole litany of paying their bills. And yet we say, don't bring that to the workplace. And yet for every person who's stressed, it stresses everyone around them. When somebody's stressed out, either I'm going to tiptoe around them, I'm not going to do the work, it brings productivity down. The worse it just seems to spiral out of control. I mean, am I wrong? Or is that a different way maybe that we can tell the story?
I would look at it a little, just like very slightly differently.
That's why you're here.
So, I know this is not at all what you were implying, but for the sake of clarity, mental illness is not contagious. It's basically, when people have a mental health condition, it develops for a whole host of reasons: genetics, trauma throughout childhood, or traumatic experiences when you are an adult, attachment problems. There are lots of reasons that people develop a mental illness, none of which are a conscious choice. People don't choose to have a mental illness. They choose how to manage it, provided they have access to resources and can actually afford to use them. Lots of marginalized communities, unfortunately, don't have access to that help, which is really terrible, and something that I know the US Surgeon General is trying to work on. So, however, when it comes to stress and the behavior that results from that, people deal with stress in many different ways. There are lots of folks who go inward, and they're kind of like a duck swimming on a pond. They look calm on top, but they are freaking out beneath. You would never know. There's some people, they hide it really well. There's other people who leave a big fat stress footprint on other people, that when it's coming up for them, they automatically put it towards other people because it needs somewhere to go. And some of them do so a bit recklessly and aren't as good at managing that stress. So I think that it actually goes back a lot to emotional intelligence, because having self-awareness that you're experiencing it is one thing, but having the ability to self-manage your stress is a totally different skill. Both of them are incredibly important, but what I often find is that people lack on the latter, because as those things come up, not everybody's taught about how to constructively deal with it, especially, if their caregivers never did it for themselves, or people they hung out with didn't do it for themselves. It's a bit of the blind leading the blind. And so I would say that stress and how people manage it can be contagious, but it depends on how it's showing up for them, because people deal with it very differently. There are some folks who can really take it in stride, and there's other people who will, burst into the heat of 1,000 suns, and that can be contagious because, we're humans, we're naturally social creatures. We tend to sometimes mimic behavior that we see around us, or sometimes avoid behavior if it doesn't feel good. And so I would say that stress levels can be quite contagious, but that's where I would end that sentence.
And thank you for helping me articulate that and clarifying that,
No,
because
you're
I
fine.
should have paraphrased it. We're talking about non-clinical mental health in that
Correct.
sense.
Correct.
It's workplace
Yeah.
stress, that
That can be
someone
very
doesn't have a
contagious.
clinical diagnosis, and that's what I was really inferring, that
Yeah.
whether it's at home, such as that manager suggested, that his wife's thinking of divorcing him because all he did was work and he was never there. Even when he was physically there, he wasn't mentally there, and that created
Yeah.
stress in the family. That's what I meant by that contagious part.
Yeah.
Now, whatever the etiology was, or whatever the cause was, it could be clinical or it could be non-clinical. But so that was my path, and I want to. I don't know if this is a congratulations to you, but this was the fastest segment of Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization ever. I just looked at the clock, and we are at about 30 minutes after the hour, and we usually take about a 2-minute break. So when we come back, we're absolutely going to continue this conversation. There's so much more that we want to get into. So we're going to collect our thoughts and figure out what the next questions was going to be. But hopefully everybody is enjoying Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. It's a tough topic, but hopefully we're bringing it to light. And as Melissa said, she's only one person, but hopefully we're going to reach many, many more today by being here. And we thank all our listeners at Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. So we're going to take a really quick break, and we will be back in less than 2 minutes, as long as I can find our commercials here. There we go.
For most of us, change is freaking terrifying. And unfortunately, there's no app to adapt. That might change in the not-so-distant future. But for now, we're on our own. That means we can either accept our default future or reimagine our tomorrow. For those of you who choose default, good luck. Just remember, there's no pause button for change. You can't turn back the clock. And there's no get-out-of-jail-free card in this age of perpetual uncertainty. Like it or not, change will happen all around us. And that change is not becoming just more disruptive and frequent, but volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, or VUCA. Fortunately, you can make change work for you and turn it into your personal and competitive advantage. Reimagine your future to one in which you're living with purpose, you're happy, and you're growing, thriving, and flourishing. If you're ready to rewrite your next life chapter and regain control of your destiny in this never normal world, your journey starts here. Contact the leader in adaptability and making change work for you, your team, and your organization. Ira S. Wolfe, adaptability.expert.
There's a certain kind of coach who believes what we believe, who leads people to greatness, who gets people unstuck, who unlocks all of your passion. A coach who helps people discover what drives them, to tap into their superpowers. That knowing your why is the first step to untap potential, to focus, to breakthroughs. A coach who's looking for a better way. Are you that coach?
Hey, welcome back, everyone, to Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. We're here today with our organizational psychologist, not our organizational psychologist, but organizational psychologist, Melissa Doman. Hopefully she'll become our organizational psychologist. But fascinating topic. We're talking about how to get workplace mental health right. And Jason, I think you had a question you wanted to reach out to Melissa with.
Yeah, I thought it would be good to start on this side of the break with diving into some of the how, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are like, okay, you've got me on the edge of my seat. I totally agree with you. We've got to change the narrative. There's a lot going on. So Melissa, when you're working with clients, what does it look like? What are some of the first steps if they're saying, yes, we want to start supporting mental health better in the workplace? What does that look like?
So I think that there needs to be a very clear why we give a bleep statement. I figured I shouldn't curse on this podcast, so why they give a bleep about doing this, because if there isn't a reasonably authentic reason about why this is being done, people can smell BS pretty easily, or something that's performative or like a checkbox. So anytime I work with organizations, it's not just them bringing me in to do a keynote or a fireside or a training or whatever. I basically say, we need to tell people why we're doing this, what is going to be included, what are the outcomes that we're going for, and how success will be measured long term. It's a very abstract concept, so I try to make it as concrete and measurable as possible. So I often start with that. What is the reason for this business? Not why the market is telling you that you should do it. There's a very big difference. And so I think that's the first place to start. There also needs to be, depending on how much they want to dive in, I always advise them to create a roadmap. What are the pain points in the business around this topic? And what are the educational interventions that you need to deliver and to which populations to address those pain points, so you can equip people with these skills at all levels. By the way, this is often where I tend to do a bit of a gentle correction with folks, is that this is a skill set that every person in the business, regardless of tenure, position, or title, needs to have. This is not just for leaders, not just for C-suite, because people tend to think based on those job titles that if they're an individual contributor or don't have managerial, responsibilities, that they will absolve themselves of the responsibility to develop the skill set, and that's just not true. They're all chronologically aged adults, and each person needs to learn this to some degree or another. So coming up with that roadmap, with those, then really learning how to apply the education, because I can come in and deliver all of this, but there has to be the expectation of, well, here's what it looks like in practice. Here's what good looks like. And here's how we're going to be holding people accountable going forward. Now, keep in mind, we're not trying to make people feel obligated to talk about mental health in the workplace. That would be very uncomfortable and inappropriate. We're trying to give them the skills to do so as and when it comes up, and to feel psychologically safe to do so. So really helping people understand the function of this conversation within the boundaries of the workplace. Not that we're trying to create group therapy at work or turn HR into psychiatrists, because that's one of the complaints or fears that I get is, well, how do I know it's appropriate? What's too far? What's my blah, blah, blah. And I say, I'm really happy you asked that question, because just because we're talking about this in the workplace context doesn't mean it's going to become a medicalized conversation, or that there are certain things that you should feel obligated to help with that you shouldn't and you're not qualified to. So it's understanding, what is my role in these conversations? How can I enter these conversations with trying to have more of a picture of what I am looking for? Why am I bringing this up in the workplace? What am I trying to get out of it? If I want to support others, how do I want to do that? How do I want to let other people know that I'm up for these conversations? So I tend to look at all levels, whether it's C-suite, coming from HR, coming from leaders, from the person who's sharing, from the person who's supporting. You have to look at all angles of the prism, because I really just look at it as developing conversational literacy about a language that we all need to know how to speak. So I start with the comms and the why, put a roadmap in place. So you're not just doing, checkbox on Mental Health Awareness Day in October, or Mental Health Awareness, World Mental Health Day in October, Mental Health Awareness Month in May, that you're showing that it's an ongoing endeavor, because it always matters. And so having that present, it's teaching people a communication skill like anything else. So I tend to tell them to incorporate that into their professional development plans. And also, oftentimes when it comes to, especially for leaders and stuff like that, there are a lot of folks now in their reviews are putting in behavioral assessments from a skill perspective. So what I mean by that is, I've seen some, HR folks who are creating these assessments where it says, are you practicing encouragement and empathy and supportive behaviors towards others? How are you elevating other people? It's not the question of, do you support your team with mental health? That's not the question. The question is, are you a supportive manager? Do you practice these behaviors and values with your team? So finding non-pressury, non-clinical ways to then evaluate how those skills are developing over time. Because if you develop the education, but you're not showing people how to apply it and then say, well, hey, this actually matters, down the road, it's all for nothing. So I try to make it as concrete as possible, but you got to start with the comms and then creating some legs under it, and then you execute.
And has anything changed with remote work in terms of how you're doing that now? Has that made anything more complex, or actually made it better?
I just tend to be very, very explicit about the importance of vocal and facial tones in these conversations. There are a lot of things that can get lost in written communication, and people are really good at assigning meaning to written communication that may not be accurate to what that person is trying to say. So I also try to remind people that just because we are seeing each other in a screen and not physically in person doesn't mean you can't have these conversations. You just have to be more mindful of the medium in which you're having them. So there's also a lot of because people are changing out the stressors. I'm not going to say removing, but changing out their stressors from communicating or being in an office or what have you. It doesn't mean that just because you're working from home doesn't mean you're not having mental health struggles. You should still be able to talk about that, but it's just going to be in a different medium and in a different fashion. So I just let people know how to pay extra attention to how they have these conversations in a remote environment.
So Melissa, you talked a couple of times about skill sets. So, and you heard the commercial, I think, for adaptability. And we use a framework, and we talk about adaptability skills, and then we talk about, how people's personality and traits might impact it, but also the company culture. So when we talk about company culture, we look at this. Do people feel that there's support from management? Do they feel that there's support from their team and their direct manager? And is there a psychologically safe space? So we're creating an environment. Then but when you talk about skills, the default seems to be is that, we're going to equip our employees with the skills they need. And we talk about grit and resilience and learning and unlearning and growth mindset. But it almost puts all the responsibility back on the employee. And we always try to be fair that they live in an environment,
They both matter.
and I think this is where you were going with this with managers, is that not only everybody needs to be equipped with that, but managers need to be equipped. But I guess my
Everyone.
challenge is that there are so many reports, and we don't have to do a study with this. We know they exist, of the toxic workplaces. So now we're having managers who are just bad at managing people, and that now they're supposed to create an environment that and have the ability to have an easier conversation about mental health, but they're not very good at even doing the technical stuff.
So I'm going to be really honest. Not all companies are going to do this, and not all companies are going to do it well. And I wish I could say that this will come up in every business, every industry. That's not the way of the world. There are always going to be some organizations or leaders who just don't care and don't want to bring it in, or it's too high risk. And I think setting the expectation otherwise is unrealistic. And so I think there is a balance between a culture in its practice, not its website description, but also the individual responsibility of each adult that works there. I think it is a balance for both, because people have to take their own skill development into account, but there also has to be the duty of care on behalf of the organization for a psychologically and physiologically safe workplace to be able to use those skills. So I look at both parties and I say, you're all responsible. But not every business is going to talk about this. And I don't shy away from that, because that's not how humans work. And while I would love to say that someday there's going to be zero stigma attached to talking about mental health, that's not possible. There are too many factors that go into what we think about what this organ does. There's too many factors. There's 8 billion people on the planet. There will always be some sort of stigma or crappy language that people say attached to this topic, or people who don't see the value, or people who do it for the wrong reasons. What we're trying to do is to get the majority of those businesses and those people to try to get it right, so that the ones who don't are like the weird ones in the corner.
Yeah, and I'm so glad the way you gave that context, because one is it's not only practical and realistic, but from what we're trying to do is give people solutions. And for companies that are looking for solutions,
Yeah.
how can I attract better talent? How can I retain better talent? How can our organization grow and thrive? How do we become a better a better contributor to our community and to
Yeah.
the world. Is the good news is, as you admitted, and we all know, we recognize this, many, I won't say most, but many organizations just aren't going to do it, even if they have the best of intentions, because it's going to take a lot of work, which means that it creates an enormous opportunity for those that do.
Yeah. Hmm.
Go ahead.
And it's there's I think it's also important to note the reasons that organizations don't do it. There's a lot of easy ways to assume why they don't. And I think it's important to think about why. It doesn't make it right that they're not doing it, but there is always a reason that organizations avoid this conversation, whether it's too liability ridden, whether they think that bringing it up is too high risk in terms of the outcomes that that organization is responsible for, whether the leaders in that business are all of a certain time period where it's just not something they talked about. There are lots of reasons that companies don't bring it up, or more importantly, they want to and they don't know how, or they want to have resources but they can't afford it. There's lots of reasons, and I think it's important for people to, especially if they're working for a business who doesn't, to discern why it's not being brought up, if it's possible to be brought up in the future, and if not, if they have the luxury of going elsewhere, if that's the right place for them. That's not a popular thing to say, but sometimes, whether it's managers or the business as a whole, that ecosystem is telling you what it won't and can't give you. Well, if you want to work for a business that will, you might have to go elsewhere if you can afford to go elsewhere.
And Melissa, to
Sadly,
piggyback on that, a couple of years ago, I wrote an article about, should we have an OSHA for mental health? Should there be a basal standard of mental health care, intervention, support in the workplace?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, have you ever thought about that, any resources on it, or just have a strong opinion on that type of a concept?
So I think that it's really challenging, because to be able to afford benefits for a business can be really expensive. And so if there's going to be a requirement to provide mental health benefits for a business, for the businesses who can't afford it, there has to be some sort of support infrastructure in place for them to assist them in providing those resources for their employees, because not everybody can afford it. And so I think there's that practicality piece of the money, if we're being really honest. But I also think that I'm curious to see how things are going to evolve ever since the US Surgeon General came out about toxic workplaces being extremely harmful for mental health. And you have to walk a very fine line, because when it comes to support in the workplace, I will never forget, I was on a panel a number of years back, and someone was saying, well, there should be an in-house therapist in every workplace. And I said, I don't agree. I don't agree. And I realized that you wouldn't expect me to say that, but here's why I'm saying that. Because doesn't it sound nice that there could be a counselor, a therapist, something like that on staff where people can go talk to that person? It sounds nice in theory. However, in practice, because not all human beings do things for the right reasons or get it right, there will be scenarios that if an employee is acting differently or is being dubbed as being difficult or something like that, they'll just be very quick to send them to the therapist in-house. And then I see lots of occasions potentially where they're trying to pressure that therapist to share details, which is completely illegal. And so I just see a lot of complications evolving from that. There are some organizations that do employ in-house therapists, but there are very, 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 very strict rules around confidentiality, limits to that being harm to self, harm to others, child abuse, elder abuse. But I just see a lot of complications with that. So I think that where I see it more realistically going is from a logistics and financial perspective. But I really think that there need to be resources in place to support those businesses who can't afford to give those resources to the employees. I do think from an anti-discrimination standpoint that we are moving more towards the protection of employees who are discriminated against for mental health issues, because historically speaking, the US is very employer focused. There's lots of, protections for employers, not as much as for employees. Where actually in the UK and the EU, it's quite the opposite. There's more protections for employees than employers. So I see a lot more protection coming for the individual, down the road, with protected characteristics becoming a more common concept, things like that. But when it comes to mental health, it's a much more three-dimensional line to walk than just physical health.
Melissa, sadly, we're coming pretty close to the end here, and there's a couple of things that we like to wrap up with, but we always
Sure.
like to give our guests an opportunity to answer this question, and I'm almost afraid to do it because just listening to you, I've got a billion questions, so I'm sure there's a lot of things we didn't ask. The question is there a specific question that we should have asked you that we didn't?
Oh, I would say that a good one we could cover off really quickly is, why is intentionality of language around this topic in the workplace so critical?
Well, why is intentionality so critical?
So, oftentimes people will inappropriately co-opt language around mental health to describe how they're feeling or an experience that they're encountering, or the way that describing mental health initiatives in the workplace is done can be a little too flexible and sometimes haphazard. So what I would say is that being very intentional about how you name these sorts of initiatives, what you're trying to achieve, not dancing around those concepts. Don't call it mental wellness or bringing your best self to work. Just call it what it is, mental health in the workplace. Or when people are having this conversation in the workplace and they find that using these words in a more malleable way that isn't as policed can be really dangerous, because if people are using terms inappropriately to describe another person or something they've encountered, you never know what people are privately struggling with. So if people are using stigmatizing language around mental health or mental illness, that's a great way to make people feel like, well, this is not a safe place for me to talk about this. Or if there is unintentional toxic positivity in how initiatives are named, like creating a positive culture around mental health sounds great in practice, but what that tells people is your negative thoughts and experiences are not welcome here, and you better put a smile on that face. So that's just a little nugget at the end.
I love it, Melissa. And that segues perfectly into our last segment that we have for you before we hop off here. And that is the lightning round. I'm going to ask you just a few questions to get to know you a little bit better personally. So let's start with this one. How about a favorite band, musical artist, or song for you?
Favorite band is the Lone Bellow.
Oh, I've never heard of them before.
Oh my God, they're amazing. They have voices of angels.
What genre are they? What type of music?
Gosh, they're like Americana, folk, rock, gospel, all kind of put into one. And I've seen them like half a dozen times, and I'm absolutely obsessed. I'm actually seeing them in a couple weeks here in Denver. And I don't think they get nearly as much attention as they should. And their voices are like ethereally gorgeous. And I am not religious at all, but every time they sing, they take me to church.
Oh, so, I love that. Well, you've just given me a new group. I'm going to put in my Spotify this afternoon and check them out. So thank you for that. And how about this one? If there was anybody in the history of the world that you could spend a day with, who would it be?
That's such a hard question.
Or maybe just a century.
Oh man. Bob Marley.
That's a first. I love that.
Yeah. He just wanted to spread love through music and wanted to help people enjoy their time on this earth and with each other. And he just seems like he was, pretty decent human being.
I love that. And I think he would have loved today's conversation too on mental health. I think that's
I
something
hope
he
so.
probably would care about. Absolutely. And this final one here,
Yeah.
going back to high school, what's something that your high school classmates would probably be surprised to see about Melissa Doman now?
Be surprised to see about me now. Probably that I stand up for myself more often. Yeah, I think they would be surprised at that. I know that anybody who knows me now is like, what are you talking about? You've probably been doing that since you were in diapers. And actually, no, I qualify myself as a recovering people pleaser. So I think seeing me stand up for myself to friends more often is something I think that would surprise people.
I love that. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that area of growth
Yeah,
with us,
nothing to be
Melissa.
ashamed
And
of. Yeah.
no, absolutely not. And that's what the show's all about is talking about these things. And thank you for helping us not only talk about, but give leaders practical steps on how to go about bringing about positive structure and supports in their organization for mental health for everybody. And for everyone who's listening, you can learn more about Melissa's work by going to melissadoman.com. And she's also very active on LinkedIn, puts out tremendous content, so you can connect with her there as well. Any other ways for people to get in touch with you, Melissa?
You can also follow me on Instagram at The Wandering Mel or Twitter at Melissa Doman LLC. But LinkedIn or my website is the best place to get in touch with me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Melissa. It was fascinating. As I said in the first segment, I can't believe how fast it went in the second and the whole conversation. I've got a list of questions here, so we definitely want to have you back. And at the end, thank you for, I think your answer to your question exemplified what we talk about all the time about living your purpose is, what your classmates might be talking about you, how see you now differently. The reality is when you live your purpose, when you find your purpose, it changes you. You're willing to stand up and do what it takes.
Well, my 20-year high school reunion is actually coming up, which is wild to think about. So, maybe I'll go. We'll see.
Well, up until that point, everything was good, but 20 years is like long in my rearview mirror.
Oh, man.
Thank you again. I really appreciate it. And they can get your book on your website as well as Amazon.
Oh, it's available across all major retailers. So on
Okay,
my
excellent.
website, there is a page that has like all the different retailers listed, but you can get it Barnes and Noble, Amazon, local bookstore. It's everywhere.
Perfect. And it should be. Hey, thanks very
Thank you.
much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Ira, that really was. I know we say every week it goes by fast. That one was super fast. It was like we entered some kind of a DeLorean and just flew through time there. What were some of the big takeaways for you?
That's that superpower, that time travel that everybody seems to want to have.
That's right,
teleporting,
teleportation.
right? Yeah. Real quickly, because I know we're short on time here. I wrote down a couple things. One is, I think the question about what does good mental health look like in the workplace? I think that was a question that Melissa had started with. And I think another point that you made was, is putting that full-time therapist or having a wellness office. And you don't want to obligate employees to have to talk about it. And, aside that, look, is people say, hey, we're going to offer this. We have all these great programs. But then get upset when people don't take advantage of it and not look at the reasons they don't. But also you can't force people or obligate people to do that. And of course, the final statement of how she tied in living a purpose and not unknowingly did that. And that's what happens when you live your purpose. It just changes your life.
That's right. Absolutely. The two for me real quickly were when she made the statement that if you're a leader of an organization, you want to see mental health claims going up. You want people accessing these resources and feeling like it's okay to get the help that they need. So amen to that. And then the other one that I loved was just the whole premise of her book, that it's not mental health and stop connecting mental health and productivity, mental health and profits, mental health and employee engagement. Okay, we understand that and it's been well researched, as she mentioned, that yes, improved mental health in the workplace leads to those improved business outcomes. But to start with, if you're the leader of an organization, the very foundation of why you should be focusing on positive mental health initiatives and policies and practices in your business is because it's the right thing for people. It's the humane thing to do. It is a basic need, just like they would need air, water, food, shelter, as anything else. And so we need to stop treating it as though it's some kind of extra added benefit that then superpowers your profits. Yes, it does do that, but that's not the why behind why you should be focusing on it and making it a priority this year. And so with that, I just want to thank you, Googleization Nation, for tuning in today. If you haven't liked and subscribed to the podcast, please do so. We've got a brand new website, geeksgeezersgoogleization.com. You can check it out there. And if you haven't joined our exclusive community, Googleization Nation, it's free to join. All I have to do is provide your email address, and you can get some of the best tips and resources and sneak previews of things that are coming out around the corner. So until next time, I'm Jason Cochran signing off.
And I'm Ira Wolfe. Special thanks to Y Institute for partnering with us and sponsoring this episode. Thank you to Melissa Doman again. Please go check her website out at melissadoman.com and check out her book, as Jason was talking about. Thank you, too, for being part of Googleization Nation. And until next time, don't let the shift hit your plans.